My daughter-in-law sent me a text that said, "You're not welcome at Thanksgiving this year. We need space from your negativity. Please respect our boundaries." My son read it and said nothing. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter, stood very still for a moment, and then did something I hadn't planned to do. I opened my online banking and cancelled both automatic e-transfers I'd been sending them every month for 4 years. 2 minutes later, my son called. He'd never called that fast in his life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a woman who spent 40 years putting everyone else first finally learned what it felt like to put herself first instead. My name is Marian, and I'm 64 years old. I live in a semi-detached house in Kitchener, Ontario, the same house where I raised 2 children and where my husband Frank and I spent the better part of our marriage. Frank died 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. He was 61. I was still working as an administrative coordinator at a regional health centre. Still had 2 more years before I'd planned to retire, and suddenly I was coming home every evening to a house that felt like it had been emptied of all its air. My daughter lives in Calgary. She calls every Sunday, usually for about 40 minutes, and she actually asks how I'm doing before she starts talking about her own week. My son lives 35 minutes away in a newer subdivision just outside Cambridge. He married his wife 6 years ago. I'll be honest, I tried. I brought casseroles. I remembered birthdays. I bit my tongue more times than I can count. But there was always something slightly off, always a tension I couldn't quite name, always the sense that I was an inconvenience being tolerated rather than a person being welcomed. After Frank died, I leaned on my son. That's the truth of it. I'm not proud of how desperate I felt in those first months, but I was. I was terrified of being irrelevant, terrified of drifting so far from my children's lives that I'd become a stranger to them. And so I made myself useful in the only way I knew how to, at that point, financially. It started the October after Frank passed. My son called and said they were short for their mortgage renewal. Rates had gone up, the new payment was higher than expected, and could I help out just this once? I said yes before he even finished the sentence. I transferred $2,000 from my savings account. He said, "Thank you, Mom. You're a lifesaver." I held on to those words for weeks. Then it was the following spring. His wife's car needed significant repairs, rotors, brakes, some kind of suspension issue. Could I lend them $1,500? I sent it the same afternoon. Then there was a dental bill not fully covered by insurance. Then a home inspection revealed problems with the foundation of the house they were hoping to buy, and they needed help with the shortfall on their down payment. I gave them $12,000. My brother-in-law, Frank's younger brother, quietly asked me if I was sure. I told him I was. I told him that's what family does. I set up an automatic e-transfer after that. $800 the first of every month. My son never asked for it formally. I just offered, and he accepted, and it became the rhythm of things. His wife never thanked me for it, not once, but occasionally she would send a photograph of their kitchen renovation or their new backyard furniture, and I would understand that the money was working its way into their lives in ways they didn't feel the need to discuss with me. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I had enough. Frank's life insurance had been substantial. He had always been careful about those things, and I had my pension from the health centre and what was left in our joint savings. I told myself I was helping, that this was what mothers did. But I'd started to notice things. My son called me about once every 2 or 3 weeks, and the calls almost always contained a financial component, a question about whether I'd sent the transfer yet or a new situation that needed addressing. When I called him just to talk, the conversations lasted 7 or 8 minutes before he said he had to go. His wife had stopped speaking to me directly at family events. She would address her remarks to my son, or to the room in general, and I would be in the room and she would simply arrange herself so that I wasn't quite there. Last Thanksgiving, I drove to their house with a turkey I'd brined overnight and a butternut squash soup from scratch. I'd also brought a card for their daughter, my granddaughter, who had just turned 3. My son let me in. His wife was on her phone in the kitchen. She looked up when I came in, said, "Hi, Marion," and looked back down. My granddaughter was in the living room watching something on a tablet. She ran to me, which was the only moment in the whole afternoon that felt real. Dinner was fine in the way that things are fine when everyone is being careful. My son talked about work. His wife talked to her own sister, who had also come, more than to anyone else. At one point, I mentioned that I'd been thinking of taking a trip. My friend Paulette had suggested a 2-week tour of Portugal in the spring, and it sounded lovely. My daughter-in-law looked at me with an expression I can only describe as assessing and said, "That sounds expensive." Not enthusiastically, not warmly, just that. That sounds expensive. As if my finances were a resource she had a stake in managing. I drove home that evening and sat in Frank's armchair and thought about that expression on her face. I didn't sleep well. 3 weeks later, I sent a message to my son asking about Christmas. I kept it light. I said I'd love to spend it together, either at my place or theirs, whichever was easier, and that I'd handle all the cooking if they came to me. I waited 2 days. Then my daughter-in-law texted from what I assumed was my son's phone, since I didn't have her number saved separately. "You're not welcome at Thanksgiving this year. We need space from your negativity. Please respect our boundaries." It said Thanksgiving, but it was clearly meant to say Christmas. Either she hadn't noticed or she hadn't bothered to reread it. I sat with that message for a long time. Negativity. I turned the word over. I had brought food to their house. I had been quiet when I wanted to speak, agreeable when I had opinions, present without being pushy. I had sent $800 a month for 4 years. I had given them $12,000 toward a house. I was, apparently, negative. I waited for my son to say something. We were on a family group chat. He'd certainly seen the message. Hours went by. That night, around 11, I texted him directly. I said, "Did you see what she sent me?" His response came the next morning. He said he had, and that she was stressed and that maybe it would be better to talk after the new year. I didn't respond to that. Instead, I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. I don't know exactly what I was looking for when I opened my banking. Some kind of accounting, maybe. Some way of seeing what the last 4 years had actually looked like. I spent 2 hours going back through statements. I made a spreadsheet. Frank had taught me to keep detailed records, insisted on it actually, and I'd always been grateful for the habit. The numbers that came together on that screen were not what I'd imagined. Monthly e-transfers, $800 for 46 months, $36,800. The down payment contribution, $12,000. The car repairs, $1,500. The dental bill, $920. The mortgage shortfall in that first October, $2,000. Various birthday and Christmas gifts. Grocery runs when they'd said they were stretched. A new crib when my granddaughter was born because theirs from a friend turned out to fail a safety standard. On and on for a total I had to add twice because I didn't believe it the first time. $68,440 in 4 years. I sat back in my chair. The house was completely quiet except for the sound of the furnace cycling on. $68,000. Frank's life insurance, the money he had worked for and set aside specifically so I would not have to worry in my older years, was more than half gone. I thought about Frank. I thought about what he'd said to me once when my son was in his late 20s and going through a rough patch, between jobs, asking us for help regularly. Frank had said, "Ma, there's a difference between helping someone through hard times and building a floor under them so they never feel the ground." I'd thought he was being harsh at the time. I'd told him so. He'd let the subject drop the way he often did, and I'd thought I'd won the argument. But sitting at that table at 2 in the morning, I understood what he'd meant. I had built my son a floor, and standing on that floor, he and his wife had decided I was a source of negativity who needed to be kept away from Christmas. I opened the e-transfer portal, found the recurring payment, $800 to my son's account, first of every month. I stared at the cancel button for a long moment. I thought about what would happen. I thought about my granddaughter's face when she ran to me at Thanksgiving. I thought about whether I would lose even that. Then I thought about Frank, about the folder in the filing cabinet in the spare room that I had been too sad to open since he died. I closed the laptop. I went to the spare room. The filing cabinet was olive green and slightly dented on one side from a move we'd done in 1998. I opened the bottom drawer. There was a folder labeled in Frank's careful printing for Marion. Read when needed. I sat on the floor right there and opened it. There was a letter, 2 pages, handwritten in the particular cramped style he'd had since university, pressing hard with the pen because he always said it made the words feel more serious. Ma, it started. If you're reading this, I'm already gone, and I'm sorry for that. I wish I could have stayed longer. You know I would have. He wrote about the money he'd left me. He said he knew I would want to share it with the kids, that it was one of the things he loved most about me, and also one of the things that worried him. He wrote, "You are generous to a fault, and I mean that literally. It can become a fault if you're not careful. The kids love you. I know they do. But love and gratitude aren't always the same thing, and you deserve both." He wrote that he hoped I would travel. He specifically mentioned the east coast of Newfoundland, which we'd always said we'd do together, but never had. He wrote that he hoped I would stop apologizing for taking up space. He wrote, "If someone is treating you like a problem to be managed, you are allowed to stop managing yourself on their behalf. You are not a problem, Ma. You are the whole point." I read it 4 times. The second time I cried. The third time I felt something shift, very quietly in the center of my chest. The 4th time I folded it carefully, put it in the pocket of my housecoat, and went back to the laptop. I cancelled the e-transfer. Then I found the Christmas message and replied to it with one word: understood. I turned my phone off and went to bed. I slept for nearly 6 hours straight, which I hadn't done in months. The next morning, I turned the phone back on. 14 missed calls, 11 text messages. My son, my son, my son, his wife, my son again. I made tea first, then I read them. The progression was predictable once I saw it. First, my son asking what was going on, then his wife asking if I had actually cancelled the transfer, then my son saying they needed to talk, then his wife saying the mortgage payment was in 4 days and she was counting on that deposit, then my son asking me to please just call him. I called my daughter instead. She picked up on the second ring. I told her everything, from the message to the spreadsheet to Frank's letter. When I finished, there was a silence, and then she said, quietly and precisely, "Mom, $68,000. And then, does she even call you by your first name?" She didn't, as it happened. She called me Marion when she had to refer to me directly, but mostly I was just she or left unnamed entirely. My daughter pointed this out as significant. My daughter said she was catching a flight. I told her not to. I told her I needed to do this part myself. My son arrived at my door the next afternoon. He looked tired and uncertain, which I recognized because it was the look he'd had as a teenager when he knew he'd done something wrong and hadn't figured out yet how to angle around it. He asked if he could come in. I said yes. I made him sit at the kitchen table, which felt important somehow. The kitchen table where he'd grown up doing homework, where Frank and I had talked to him about hard things over the years. He said he didn't understand why I'd cancelled the transfer without any warning. I said the message his wife had sent was the warning. He said she was stressed and hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I asked him what way she had meant it. He didn't have an answer. I slid the spreadsheet across the table. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Mom," he finally said. $68,440, I said, "in 4 years. I've been giving you $800 a month and I've covered emergencies on top of that. And when I asked to spend Christmas with you, I was told I was negative and not welcome." He looked genuinely stricken, and I believed the strickenness was real. But I'd also known him for 38 years, and I knew the difference between feeling genuinely sorry and feeling caught. "I didn't know it was that much," he said. "You didn't ask," I said. Before he could say anything else, his wife's car pulled into the driveway. He hadn't told me she was coming. I watched through the window as she got out, and I noticed that she hadn't brought my granddaughter, which I registered as a tactical decision. No softening factor. She came in without knocking. She sat down. She said very calmly that she understood I was upset, that cutting off financial support abruptly without discussion was not a mature or fair way to handle a disagreement. She said they had a budget that had incorporated my contribution, and that I was, by removing it without warning, putting their family in a difficult position. She said she was willing to have a constructive conversation about the underlying issues if I was willing to do the same. I let her finish. Then I said, "When did I become a line item in your budget?" She blinked. "Because I'm not a line item," I said. "I'm a person. I'm this man's mother. I'm your daughter's grandmother. And your text told me I wasn't welcome at a family holiday because of my negativity. And I would like you to explain to me, specifically, what I have done that is negative." She said she sometimes felt I was critical of their parenting choices. I asked for an example. She said I had commented on screen time once. I had in fact once said that I had read something interesting about children under 3 and screen time and asked if it was something they thought about. I mentioned this. She said her memory of the conversation was different. "My memory," I said, "is that I gave you $12,000 toward your house, that I have sent you $800 every single month for 4 years, that I have never once asked for anything in return except to be included in my son's life. And your memory is that I was critical because I asked a question about screen time." The conversation did not end well. My son sat very quietly through most of it. At the end, his wife said that clearly I had some unresolved feelings I needed to work through, and that she hoped I would reach out when I was in a better headspace. Then she left. My son sat at the table for another few minutes. He said he was sorry. I told him I believed him. I also told him that being sorry and doing something differently were not the same thing, and that I needed to see the second one before I'd know what to do with the first. He left. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. That evening I called Frank's former colleague, a semi-retired financial planner named Douglas, who had helped us with estate planning years ago. I told him what had happened. I asked him to help me review my accounts, make sure my remaining savings were properly protected, and update my will. He said he could see me Thursday. I said Thursday was good. I also, that night, sent a message to my friend Paulette about Portugal. The next 2 weeks were unpleasant. My son called several times. His wife did not call, but I heard from my sister-in-law, Frank's younger brother's wife, who said that she had received a call from my daughter-in-law expressing concern about my state of mind since Frank's death. She said my daughter-in-law had suggested that grief sometimes manifested in erratic financial decisions and that she was worried about me. My sister-in-law, who is sharp and has never particularly warmed to my daughter-in-law, said, "I asked her how much money you'd given them. She told me it was a few thousand here and there. I said, I see, and then I called you." I told her the real number. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'm going to call Frank's brother." Word spread through the family in that particular way that family information spreads, selectively, imperfectly, with each person adding their own interpretation. Some people called to check on me with genuine warmth. Frank's cousin, who had always been closer to my son, told me he thought I was being hard on the kids. I told him I thought he might not have all the information, and I offered to walk him through the spreadsheet. He declined. About 3 weeks after I'd cancelled the transfer, I got a call from Douglas. He'd been doing some reading at my request about protections for seniors in Ontario, about financial documentation in estate planning. He said there was something I needed to be aware of. Adult children, in certain circumstances, had sought guardianship orders over aging parents, legal mechanisms that allowed them to take over financial decision-making. He said he wasn't suggesting my situation would reach that point. He said he was suggesting I be aware it existed and take some preventative steps. He said we should make sure my will was updated, that I had a proper power of attorney in place naming someone I trusted, my daughter, my sister-in-law, not my son, and that I document my financial history carefully. I appreciated his candor. I did not think my son and his wife would go that far. 3 weeks later, I received a registered letter. I had to sign for it at the door. The return address was a law firm in Cambridge. Inside was a formal document. It was a notice that my son and his wife had engaged a lawyer to explore whether a capacity assessment was warranted, given concerning changes in financial behaviour and suspected cognitive decline following the death of her spouse. I sat down on the front step. In December in Kitchener, I sat on the cold concrete step, and I held that letter and I read it twice. They were claiming I was losing my mind. I called my daughter first. She was on a flight to Toronto within 2 hours of my call. I called Douglas. I called my sister-in-law. And then, on Douglas's strong recommendation, I called a lawyer, a woman named Agnes, who specialized in elder law and who came highly recommended by Douglas's own firm. Agnes listened to everything I told her in a tone of professional calm that told me she had heard variations of this story before. She said that capacity assessments were a real legal mechanism in Ontario and that a family member could, under certain conditions, request one. She said the assessment itself would almost certainly find nothing wrong with me, but that the process could be used to create delay and uncertainty while pressure was applied. She said the most important thing I could do was document everything, cooperate fully with any assessment, and ensure my legal affairs were in order so there was nothing to contest. I did all of those things. I also asked my GP for a full cognitive assessment as a precaution, which she administered the following week. I scored, she told me, well above average for my age group on every measure. She wrote a letter to that effect for my file. The formal assessment when it happened was thorough and not pleasant. Not because anything went wrong, but because there is something profoundly humiliating about being required to prove you are in possession of your own mind. A psychologist in her 50s administered it over 2 sessions. She tested memory, reasoning, processing speed, executive function. She asked about my life, my relationships, my finances. I was honest about all of it, including my own role in creating the dynamic with my son. She made careful notes. 2 weeks later, Agnes called me. The assessment found no evidence of cognitive impairment, she said. Your scores are excellent. The psychologist's report is not particularly kind to the people who initiated this process. The matter was dropped. There was no hearing, no further legal action. My son's lawyer apparently advised him to let it go. What there was instead, about 3 months later, was a Saturday afternoon knock at my door. My son stood on the step, alone. He looked worse than I'd seen him in years. Thin in the face, a sort of hollowness around his eyes. He asked if he could come in. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. He said his wife had left. She had moved to her parents' house in Barra 6 weeks earlier. They were in the process of a separation. He had primary care of their daughter, my granddaughter, during the week. He was managing. I listened. I didn't say anything for a long time. He said he owed me an apology. He said it wasn't enough, and he knew it wasn't enough. but that he had spent the last several months looking at his own behavior clearly for the first time in years, and that what he saw wasn't good. He said he had started seeing a therapist. He said the therapist had used a word, enmeshment, that he'd had to look up, and that when he read the definition, something had shifted for him. He said he had let his wife take the lead in their relationship with me for years because it was easier than managing the tension between them. He said he had told himself that her instincts about relationships were better than his, and he had used that as a reason not to think too hard about what was actually happening. He said, looking at the spreadsheet now, he understood that he had let someone else's convenience become his mother's ongoing financial sacrifice, and that he had thanked me for it and then let it happen again and again. I knew, he said. On some level, I think I knew. I said, I think you did too. He didn't look away. That meant something. I told him what I was willing to offer and what I was not. I told him that I would be in his life, and more importantly, in my granddaughter's life, and that I was glad she was going to be around more. I told him I would answer the phone when he called. I told him I wanted to hear about his weeks, his struggles, his ordinary Tuesday evenings. I told him I was interested in his actual life, not in being a resource extraction point within it. I told him there would be no more automatic transfers, no more emergency contributions, no more standing offers of financial support. If he found himself genuinely unable to pay a bill, not inconvenienced, but genuinely unable, he could talk to me about it, and we would discuss it as two adults, not as a withdrawal from a machine that existed for his convenience. He nodded. He said he understood. I asked him about the legal process. I asked him directly, sitting across the table from him, whether he had known what his wife was doing when she engaged that lawyer. He said he had known. He said he had told himself that she was just protecting their interests, that the word she'd used was protecting, and that he had let himself believe it because believing anything else was too hard. He said he had not known until he saw the document himself that the word dementia would appear in it. He said that seeing it written down was the moment he had understood what was actually happening. That was my mother, he said. That was a document saying my mother was losing her mind, and I had signed something that allowed it to exist. I've thought about that almost every day since. I believed him. I also knew that believing someone and trusting them were not the same thing, and that trust was going to take considerably longer. My daughter visited in the spring. We drove up to Collingwood for a long weekend, walked along the escarpment, ate too much at a small restaurant that had been there for decades. She told me about her life in Calgary. Work was going well. She was happy. She had been learning to ski badly and enjoying it. On the last morning, over coffee at the kitchen table in the rental cottage, she asked how I was actually doing. I told her I was better than I had been. I told her I was going to Portugal with Paulette in September. I told her I had been to a grief support group at the library in Kitchener, the kind Frank would have teased me gently for attending, and that I had found it more useful than I expected. I told her I had started swimming again, 3 mornings a week at the community centre pool. I told her I had been to a watercolour class once, decided it was not for me, and joined a book club instead, which suited me much better. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that was partly relief and partly something else, something I recognized as the kind of love that comes with having been genuinely frightened for someone and then watching them come back. Dad would be annoying about this, she said. He would be very pleased with himself for having seen it coming. He would, I agreed. My granddaughter spent Christmas with me. My son brought her in the afternoon. She is 3 now and completely fearless, and she spent most of the visit reorganizing my kitchen cupboards with a seriousness that reminded me of Frank. We made sugar cookies from a recipe that had been my mother's. She fell asleep on the couch at 5 o'clock with icing on her left ear. My son stayed for dinner. We talked about unremarkable things, a podcast he'd been listening to, a problem he was having with the fence in his backyard. what he was thinking of getting his daughter for her birthday. Normal conversation, the kind that costs nothing and means something. After he left, I washed up and sat in Frank's armchair with a cup of tea and thought about what the last year had been. I had lost $68,000. That was real, and it was gone. Douglas and I had restructured the remainder of my savings into instruments that were properly protected and clearly documented. I had updated my will. My power of attorney named my daughter and my sister-in-law jointly. My finances were, for the first time in 4 years, my own. I had nearly lost something harder to quantify, the quiet confidence that I was capable of making my own decisions, that my own perceptions of my life were accurate, that I was not, in some gradually accelerating way, losing my grip on things. I had needed an official assessment to tell me what I had known, and there was something about that, about having needed it externally confirmed, that I was still honestly working through. But I had found Frank's letter, and whatever else had happened in the past year that was mine, those words in his handwriting, pressed hard into the page because he'd always said it made them more serious. You are not a problem, Ma. You are the whole point. I had booked Portugal. I had bought new walking shoes. I had told Paulette she was in charge of the itinerary and that I was only responsible for showing up, which she said was the most sensible thing I'd said in years. In the new year, my son asked me once, carefully and without pressure, whether there was any possibility of rebuilding what we'd lost. I said I thought there was. I said it would take time and that the shape of it would be different, not because I was punishing him, but because I had learned something true about myself in the last year, which was that I did not actually need to earn my place in my children's lives, that I was allowed to take up space without apologizing for it. He said he understood. I said, I know you mean that. Show me. He has been, slowly, trying to do exactly that. He calls on Tuesday evenings now, just to talk. Last month he came over on a Saturday with no agenda, and we watched a documentary about migratory birds, which neither of us particularly had a strong opinion about, but which turned out to be more interesting than expected. He asked about Portugal. He listened to the answer. It is not fixed. It is not what it was, and it won't be, but what it was had a $68,000 subsidy built into it. So I'm not certain what it was is worth mourning. What it is now is honest. There's real weight to that. Honest and small and slowly, carefully growing, like something planted in poor soil that turns out to be hardier than it looks. Frank's roses are in the backyard. I don't know much about roses, but I've been reading. Frank used to say that the hardest thing about loving someone is knowing the difference between what they need and what they're asking for. I didn't fully understand that until I was sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, staring at a spreadsheet that added up to $68,000 and change, and realizing that what my son had been asking for, month after month, was not the same as what either of us actually needed. What I needed was to matter. Not as a line item, not as a resource, just as a person, his mother, my granddaughter's grandmother, someone worth including in an ordinary Tuesday evening. I had confused being useful with being valued, and I had spent 4 years paying for a version of closeness that turned out not to be closeness at all. There's a kind of clarity that only comes from hitting a real limit. Not an emotional limit, not frustration or hurt feelings, but a genuine moment of looking at the facts of your own life and deciding you will not look away from them anymore. That's what the spreadsheet was for me. That's what Frank's letter was. The numbers told me the truth, and the letter gave me permission to act on it. What I learned about myself in that year, through the registered letter, through the assessment, through sitting across from my son at the table where he'd grown up, is that doing the right thing rarely feels clean when you're in the middle of it. Cancelling that transfer was the right thing to do. It did not feel triumphant. It felt frightening, and then it felt quiet, and then slowly it felt like something I recognized as my own judgment returning to me after a long absence. I think about the courage it eventually took my son to sit across from me and say plainly that he had known. That word known cost him something to say out loud, and I respected him for saying it. Not because it fixed anything, but because honesty given without a guaranteed outcome is a harder thing than most people realize. It requires a kind of integrity that had been missing from our relationship for years, and seeing it appear, however late, told me something true about who he still had the capacity to be. And I think about what it required of me to stay in that chair and listen rather than close the door. Staying took more out of me than leaving would have. Leaving is easy when you've been hurt enough. Staying and remaining clear-eyed, still caring, still boundaried, still refusing to pretend the last 4 years hadn't happened. That required something I had to rebuild in myself before I could offer it to anyone else. Frank's letter said I was not a problem. It took me the better part of a year to actually believe that. Not as a comforting idea, but as a working fact I carried into every conversation, every decision, every morning I got up and chose to tend his roses and book the trip to Portugal and show up for my granddaughter on my own terms. The roses are doing well, as it turns out. I had to learn what they needed rather than what I assumed they needed. That distinction, it seems, applies to more things than gardening.